The whole town of Dry Fork turned out that morning, not to celebrate a wedding, but to watch a father get rid of his own daughter. Amos Tucker stood on the church steps in his Sunday coat and handed his oldest girl, Pearl, over to the roughest, most feared cowboy in the territory, a big scarred man named Levi Cross. And he did it with a look on his face like a man finally setting down a heavy sack he'd been carrying too long. Pearl Tucker was 24 years old, tall and full-figured and strong as any two field hands, with kind gray eyes and flowers still under her fingernails from the biscuits she'd baked that dawn. And her own father was giving her away to a stranger just to have her out of his house. The women of Dry Fork clucked their tongues and whispered behind their hands. "That poor thing," they said. "A man like Cross will work her to death, or worse." Nobody in that whole crowd believed Pearl Tucker would find 1 ounce of happiness. But not a single one of them could have guessed what that rough cowboy was about to do, a thing that would shame every laughing mouth in Dry Fork before the year was out. To understand that morning, you have to understand what Pearl's life had been. Her mother had died when Pearl was 12, and her mother had been the only soul on earth who ever made Pearl feel like she was worth something. After that, it was just Pearl and her father. And then her father married a thin, sharp woman named Delia who looked at Pearl the way you'd look at a stain on a clean tablecloth. In that house, Pearl was not a daughter. She was a pair of hands. She rose before the sun and worked until after dark, cooking and scrubbing and mending. And no matter how hard she worked, it was never enough, and no kind word ever came. Her father was ashamed of her size, ashamed that no young man had come courting, ashamed to have her sitting at his table taking up space he thought she hadn't earned. And Pearl, God bless her, just kept working and kept her chin up and kept that big kind heart of hers from turning hard, though heaven knows the world gave her reason enough. The truth was, Pearl Tucker was the finest woman in Dry Fork, if anybody had cared to look. She could cook a meal that would bring tears to your eyes. She could deliver a calf, split a cord of wood, and nurse a sick child through the night, sometimes all in the same day. When the widow Hartley took fever, it was Pearl who sat with her. When the Miller children went hungry that hard winter, it was Pearl who left bread on their step and never said a word about it. She had more goodness in her little finger than the whole gossiping town had in its whole body. But all anybody in Dry Fork ever saw when they looked at Pearl was a big girl nobody wanted. And her father saw it worst of all. There was one bitter cold February, the winter before all this happened, that showed exactly who Pearl Tucker was. The Peterson family, poor as church mice, had all come down sick at once, the whole house full of them, mother and father and 5 little ones, with no one left standing to feed the stock or stoke the fire. It was Pearl who walked 2 miles through the snow every single morning before her own chores, to milk their cow and cook their gruel and hold their feverish babies. And she did it for 3 weeks running, and she never told a soul, and she never took a penny. When the town found out, later, they said it was a fine thing, but they said it the way you say a thing about a person you still don't quite respect. And that was Pearl's whole life in Dry Fork, right there. She gave and she gave and she gave, and the town took it all, and still, when she walked down the main street, she heard the whispers behind her back, and still, when she passed the young men outside the mercantile, she saw them look away. She had long ago stopped hoping any of it would ever change. She had folded up that particular hope and put it away, the way you put away a dress you know you'll never have occasion to wear. So when Levi Cross rode into Dry Fork that spring looking to hire on help for his ranch out past the river, Amos Tucker saw his chance, and he took it. Cross was a legend in those parts, and not a gentle one. Folks said he'd been a soldier, and then something worse. He had a long scar down one cheek and a way of looking at a man that made grown ranchers step aside. He lived alone on a big spread out past the Red River, ran it by himself, and spoke maybe 10 words a month. Some said he'd buried a wife out there years ago. Some said darker things. And Amos Tucker walked right up to that dangerous man and offered him his daughter Pearl, not as a hire, but as a wife, along with a small sum of money just to take her off his hands. It was, when you say it plain, a shameful thing for a father to do. And Levi Cross looked at Amos Tucker for a long, cold moment. Then he looked past him, to where Pearl stood in the doorway with her hands twisted in her apron. And he said one word. "All right. If you know what it feels like to be treated as a burden by the very people who were supposed to love you, then stay with this story." Because Pearl Tucker had spent 24 years being told, in 100 small, cruel ways, that she was too much and not enough all at once. And she was about to meet the first person in her whole life who would see her true. They were married that Sunday morning on the church steps, quick and joyless. And then Pearl climbed up onto the seat of Levi Cross's wagon with one small carpet bag, holding everything she owned in the world, and they drove out of Dry Fork together, the silent scarred stranger and the girl her own father had given away. Pearl sat stiff and frightened the whole first hour, braced for the cruelty she was sure was coming, waiting for the man to show his true colors the moment the town was out of sight. But the cruelty never came. After a long while, Levi Cross reached back behind the wagon seat, and Pearl flinched, and he stopped. Then, slow and careful, so as not to scare her, he brought out a folded wool blanket and laid it gentle across her lap, because the wind had come up cold off the river. "Long ride yet," was all he said. And Pearl Tucker stared at that blanket, and something in her chest that had been locked up tight for 12 long years gave the smallest little crack. When they reached the ranch, Pearl braced herself again, expecting a filthy hovel and a list of orders. Instead, Levi Cross stopped the wagon in front of a small, sturdy, weather-worn house, and he came around and helped her down as careful as if she were made of church glass. He carried her little bag inside himself. And then that big rough man stood in the middle of his own front room, turning his hat around and around in his scarred hands, and he said, awkward as a boy, "Took the big bedroom for you. Fixed the window this week. I'll bunk in the back room, till well, however you want it. There's no hurry on anything, ma'am. You're not a servant here. You're my wife, and this is your home now, and nobody's going to raise a voice to you under this roof for as long as I'm standing." And Pearl Tucker, who had not cried in front of another living soul since her mother's funeral, had to turn away toward the window so the strange kind man would not see her weep. That was the thing the whole town of Dry Fork got wrong. They saw a rough man and a girl nobody wanted, and they saw a tragedy. What they could not see was that Levi Cross knew exactly what it was to be judged by the outside of a person. He knew what it was to have folks cross the street rather than look at your scarred face. He had spent years alone on that ranch precisely because the world had decided what he was before it ever knew him. And when Amos Tucker offered him a daughter he was ashamed of, Levi Cross had looked at Pearl standing in that doorway, dignified and terrified and kind-eyed, and he had recognized her, the way one lonely soul recognizes another across a crowded room. He didn't marry Pearl to get a cook or a servant. He married her because he could not stand by and watch a good woman be handed off like an unwanted animal. And now he meant to spend every day showing her the thing nobody ever had, that she was worth something. And so a strange and beautiful thing began to happen out on that ranch by the Red River. Slowly, week by week, Pearl Tucker began to bloom. For the first time in her life, she was in a home where her work was thanked instead of demanded. Levi ate her cooking like a starving man and told her, every single meal, that it was the finest he'd ever had, and he meant it. When she mended his shirts, he thanked her. When she planted a garden, he built her a fence around it with his own hands. He never once raised his voice. He never once looked at her the way her father had. And Pearl, who was so much stronger and cleverer than anyone had ever let her be, began to run that ranch like she'd been born to it. She doctored the cattle. She kept the books. She turned that lonely, bare house into a warm and living home, with bread rising on the sill and curtains in the windows and the smell of something good always on the stove. And the ranch itself began to prosper the way a place does when someone finally loves it. Pearl had an eye for cattle that even Levi marveled at, and under her care the herd grew fat and healthy, and the calves came strong. When cattle buyers rode out from the big towns to make their deals, Pearl would feed them at her table, and word got around fast, until men were riding a full day out of their way just for the chance to do business over one of Pearl Cross's suppers. She was, without ever once trying to be, the making of that ranch. Levi took to telling anyone who'd listened that he'd gotten the better end of that bargain 100 times over, that Amos Tucker had handed him the richest treasure in the territory and been too blind to know it. And the strangest, sweetest part of all was watching that hard, scarred, solitary man learn to laugh again. Pearl brought laughter back into a house that hadn't heard it in years. She'd catch him smiling at nothing, out by the barn, and she'd ask him what was so funny, and he'd say, "Nothing. Just glad is all. Just glad you're here." And Pearl, who had spent her whole life being told she took up too much room in the world, finally understood that to the right person, there is no such thing as too much of someone you love. There was a night, early on, that Pearl would keep in her heart for the rest of her days. A bad storm had come through and torn the roof off the chicken coop, and Pearl had gone out into the rain at midnight to save the hens, and Levi had found her out there, soaked to the bone and shivering, cradling the little birds inside her shawl. He didn't scold her for being foolish. He just took off his own coat and put it around her shoulders, and the two of them worked side by side in the downpour until every last hen was safe and dry. And afterward, sitting by the fire with the rain drumming on the roof, Levi Cross told Pearl the thing he had never told another living soul. He told her about the war and the men he'd lost, and how he'd come out to that lonely ranch to hide from a world that only ever saw the scar on his face and never the man behind it. And Pearl listened, the way her mother used to listen, without judgment and without pity, and when he was done she reached over and laid her strong, warm hand on his scarred one, and neither of them said a word, and neither of them needed to. Two people the world had thrown away, sitting together by a fire, finally home. If this story is warming your heart even a little, take just a second to tap that subscribe button, because these are the stories we tell here, the quiet ones about good people who finally get the love they always deserved, and I would surely love to have you along for more of them. Because what happened next put the whole town of Dry Fork to shame. The two of them fell in love. Not all at once, but the way the strongest things grow, slow and deep and sure. Levi Cross, who had been alone and hard for so long, found himself hurrying his chores just to get back to the house and the sound of Pearl humming. And Pearl found that the scarred, silent man she had feared was the gentlest, most honorable soul she had ever known, and that when he looked at her, he did not see a big girl nobody wanted. He saw Pearl, just Pearl, the whole of her, and he thought she was beautiful, and he told her so, and the wonder of it near about knocked her off her feet. Within the year, that joyless wedding on the church steps had become a true marriage, the kind most folks only dream of. And out on that ranch, Pearl Tucker was, at long last, happy. But Dry Fork had not forgotten her, and Dry Fork was about to learn a lesson it would not soon forget. Word had drifted back to town that the Cross Ranch was thriving, that the feared Cowboy had gone soft and gentle, that Pearl's cooking was drawing cattle buyers from 3 counties who stayed for supper and paid top dollar just to sit at her table. Amos Tucker heard all of it, and Amos Tucker, who had given his daughter away with a payment just to be rid of her, began to feel something turn sour in his stomach. Because his own farm had fallen on hard times that year. His crops had failed, his new wife Delia had run through his money, and now the whole county was talking about how the daughter he'd been ashamed of had become the most respected woman on the Red River. So Amos did what small men do. He got in his wagon and he drove out to the Cross Ranch, not to beg his daughter's pardon, but to ask her for money, and to remind her, as fathers like him always do, that she owed him for raising her. He arrived at supper time, and he found his daughter Pearl standing tall and radiant in the doorway of a fine, warm home, with a good man at her side, and he did not even have the grace to be ashamed. He started right in, cold and demanding, telling Pearl it was her Christian duty to help her poor father, listing every meal he'd ever grudgingly given her, his voice getting louder and uglier the longer Pearl stood there silent. And that, right there, was when the Cowboy did the thing that shamed the whole town of Dry Fork forever. Levi Cross stepped down off that porch, slow and calm, and he put himself square between Amos Tucker and his daughter. He did not shout. He did not reach for a gun. He just looked that man dead in the eye, and in a voice quiet enough that Amos had to lean in to hear it, he said, "You had the finest woman in this whole territory living under your roof for 24 years. She cooked your meals and worked your land and never once got a kind word for it. And when you got the chance, you sold her to me like a lame mule, for pocket money, to be rid of her. Well, mister, I'll tell you what you're going to get from this ranch. Not 1 red cent. Because you already had the only treasure you were ever given, and you threw it away with both hands. This is Pearl's home now. She is loved here and honored here, and she will never want for a single thing again as long as I live. And you are going to get back in that wagon, and you are going to drive off my land, and you are never going to make my wife feel small again." And then Levi Cross tipped his hat, polite as could be, and he said, "Good evening to you." And Amos Tucker, who had never in his life been made to feel the size of what he'd done, climbed back into his wagon with his face burning red, and he drove home alone. Pearl had come out onto the porch by then, and she stood beside her husband and watched her father's wagon grow small in the distance. And she found, to her own surprise, that she felt no triumph in it, and no hatred either. Only a kind of quiet peace, like the settling of something that had been broken for a very long time. Levi turned to her, worried he had spoken out of turn, worried he had shamed her father in front of her. But Pearl just took his big, scarred hand in both of hers, and she looked up at him with those kind gray eyes brimming full, and she said, 24 years I waited for somebody to stand up for me, and I'd near about given up believing anybody ever would. And Levi Cross, who was not a man for many words, lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it, rough and gentle all at once. And he said, "Then you waited long enough, Mrs. Cross. I'll be standing up for you the rest of my days." And they stood there together on the porch as the sun went down over the Red River. And for the first time in her whole hard life, Pearl Tucker knew, all the way down to her bones, that she was safe, and she was cherished, and she was home. The story of it went through Dry Fork like a prairie fire, the way such stories do. How the rough cowboy that everybody feared had turned out to be the kindest man in the county. How the girl that nobody wanted had become the most beloved woman on the Red River, with a husband who worshipped the ground she walked on, and a home full of warmth and plenty. And one by one, the very same women who had clucked their tongues on that wedding morning and pitted that poor thing began to find reasons to ride out to the Cross Ranch, to sit at Pearl's famous table, to ask her advice, to bask in the light of a woman who had every reason to be bitter and had chosen, instead, to be kind. Pearl forgave them, mostly, because that was her way. But she never forgot who had seen her true when no one else would. Years later, when they were old and gray and that ranch by the river had grown into the finest spread in the territory, folks would still ask Levi Cross what on earth had made him say yes that shameful morning on the church steps to a bride her own father was giving away. And the old cowboy would look across the room at his Pearl, still the light of his whole long life, and he would smile that rare quiet smile, and he would say the same thing every time. Because everybody in that town looked at my Pearl and saw something they didn't want. And I looked at her, and I saw everything I'd ever prayed for. So the next time this world tries to tell you that a person's worth is written on the outside of them, you remember Pearl Tucker and the rough cowboy who saw her true. Because the ones the world throws away are so often the greatest treasures of all, and all it takes is one person with eyes kind enough to see it.